Dangerous bandit queen Belle Starr began life as a literal Southern belle. She grew up in luxury and attended a finishing school for young ladies, where she was taught the social graces, piano, and the classics. She also happened to grow up around Jesse James and other members of the James Younger gang. Shortly after the Civil War, she married a horse thief and went on to become an outlaw in her own right, whose criminal misdeeds eclipsed those of her husband. Following are 20 things about her and other dangerous women from history. A dangerous Southern belle. Crackshot Old West outlaw Belle Starr was a fashionable criminal who paid attention to style. She rode her horse side saddle while clad in a black velvet riding habit, a plumed hat atop her head, and a pair of pistols with cartridge belts across her hips. An associate of the James Younger gang, which featured the notorious Jesse James, and became infamous for a series of bank, train, and stagecoach robberies across 10 states, Belle became a dangerous criminal in her own right. Born Myra Maybelle Shirley in 1848 into a well-off family near Carthage, Missouri, Belle grew up in relative comfort. She attended Missouri's Carthage Female Academy, where she was taught the day's feminine refinements, learned piano, and received a classical education. That should have put her on the typical Southern belle path of a proper young lady, who aspired to marry a prosperous man, raise a family and do nothing interesting, let alone controversial in her life. As seen below, this belle took a different path. A belle who preferred to ride and shoot instead of take refinement lessons. In her early years, Belle Starr led the life of a coddled wealthy girl. She was reportedly a bright student at the Carthage Female Academy, and a polite young lady who excelled at playing the piano. However, she liked to rub her rich girl status in the face of her peers, and went out of her way to become the center of attention. Unlike typical Southern belles, Belle loved the outdoors. She preferred to ride and shoot with her brother Bud, instead of stay cooped up inside her all-girls school. Belle probably got her wild streak from her father, John Shirley. Although a prosperous farmer and businessman, Shirley was nonetheless considered the black sheep of a wealthy Virginia family that had moved out west. He married and divorced twice before he wed Belle's mother, Elizabeth Hatfield, a relative of the Hatfields of the Hatfield and McCoy feud. Growing up in Missouri, Belle became acquainted with future dangerous outlaws Frank and Jesse James, and the younger brothers Cole, Jim, John, and Bob, who went on to form the infamous James Younger gang. From criminal groupie to dangerous Wild West outlaw. When the Civil War broke out, Belle Starr's family were Southern sympathizers, and her brother rode with Confederate guerrillas. He was killed in 1864, and between that and the dangerous war conditions, as both sides' forces crisscrossed Missouri, Belle's family upped stakes and moved to Texas. In 1866, her childhood acquaintances, the James and Younger brothers, now joined together in the James Younger gang, robbed a Missouri bank and fled to Texas, where Belle's father often sheltered such fugitives in his house. Among their number was a former pro-Confederate guerrilla turned horse thief named Jim Reed, an associate of the James and Younger brothers. Reed had been Belle's crush ever since she was a teenager in Missouri. Soon after they renewed their acquaintance in Texas, the duo got married and eventually had 2 children. The family eventually fled to California to avoid an arrest warrant for Reed because of an Arkansas murder. Not long after, Belle graduated from criminal groupie to Wild West outlaw in her own right. The belle who got a kick out of being a bandit queen. In 1869, Belle Starr, her husband, and 2 other outlaws kidnapped and tortured an elderly Creek Indian until he told them where he had hidden about $30,000 in gold. With their share of the loot, she and her husband then returned to Texas, where Belle relished playing up the role of dangerous bandit queen to the hilt. Her hubby tried to walk the straight and narrow for a while and took a stab at farming. He soon grew restless, however, and returned to his outlaw ways. The couple resumed their social and criminal ties with the James Younger gang, and fell in with the Starr clan, a Cherokee Indian family infamous for dealing in whiskey and stealing cattle and horses in the Indian Territory, today's Oklahoma. The outlaw life finally caught up with Belle's husband in 1874, when he was killed in a gunfight with one of his criminal associates. The widowed Belle got into a relationship with a Cherokee outlaw named Buford Blue Duck, before she finally married another Cherokee criminal named Sam Starr, and settled with him in the Indian Territory. A dangerous Wild West fence, bootlegger, and protector of fugitives. Belle Starr and her husband Sam lived in a ranch north of the Canadian River that she named Younger's Bend, in honor of her childhood friend, the notorious outlaw Cole Younger. In the Indian Territory, Belle finally came into her own as a dangerous outlaw. She bootlegged illegal whiskey to Indians, exhibited a talent for the organization of cattle rustling and horse-stealing raids, and mastered the intricacies of fencing the goods stolen by other outlaws. When fugitives were on the run from the law, Belle often arranged shelter for them until the heat died down. Jesse James was among those whom she harbored under her roof. Belle's growing wealth from her criminal ventures enabled her to bribe officials to look the other way, and to free her associates whenever they were caught. That corruption caught the attention of the straight-laced hanging judge Isaac Parker in nearby Fort Smith. He grew determined to lock her up, and had her hauled up before him on various occasions to face various charges. In 1883 she and her husband were tried in Judge Parker's court on horse theft charges, were found guilty and received a 9-month sentence behind bars. An Unsolved Murder. After her release from prison, Belle Starr resumed her outlaw ways, and Judge Isaac Parker resumed his quest to put her out of business. In 1886 the dangerous Bandit Queen narrowly avoided another conviction, this time on robbery in addition to horse theft charges, but it still turned out to be a bad year for her. On December 17 her husband Sam Starr got into a gunfight with a lawman cousin of his named Frank West, and both were killed in the exchange of bullets. Belle's right to live in the Indian Territory had been based on her marriage to a Cherokee husband. To continue to use the territory as a base for her criminal ventures, she married another Cherokee, a younger relative of her deceased husband named July. It proved to be a stormy relationship, and on at least one occasion, July offered an acquaintance $200 to murder his wife. On February 3, 1889, Belle was ambushed while riding home from a neighbor's house, blasted off her horse with a shotgun, and finished off with another blast while she was on the ground. The murder was never solved, but there were quite a few suspects. Within her immediate family, they included her husband, her son whom she routinely whipped, and whom rumors speculated she might have had an incestuous relationship with, and her daughter, whom she had prevented from marrying the father of her child. Another suspect was a fugitive murderer who sharecropped on her land, and feared that she might turn him in. Madagascar's dangerous ruler. To most people today, Madagascar is best known for the lighthearted DreamWorks animation franchise of the same name, and its bevy of anthropomorphic wildlife. In the 19th century, though, the island was better known for darker reasons, as the realm of a psychotically dangerous ruler. She was Queen Ranavalona I, who had a tongue-twister of a birth name, Ramavo, and ruled Madagascar from 1828 until her death in 1861. Nicknamed Ranavalona the Cruel, she was a tyrant at best, and possibly a certifiably insane madwoman at worst. Whatever her deal was, Ranavalona's 33-year reign was a complete and utter disaster for her people. She cut off Madagascar from the outside world, pursued a policy of isolation and self-sufficiency, made heavy use of forced labor, and crushed all opposition, real or imagined. Between murder, massacre, mass enslavement, repression and the resultant famines, millions of her subjects perished. During the craziest stretches of her reign, it is estimated that half the population of Madagascar died, either directly according to her orders, or as a result of her disastrous policies. A queen who kicked off her reign with a massacre of all potential rivals. The rise of Ranavalona began when her father informed Madagascar's king Andrianapoinamarina, they went for ludicrously long names in Madagascar, of a plot against his life, so the king showed his appreciation by selecting the informant's daughter to marry his son and heir. The marriage proved loveless, however, and produced no issue. When Ranavalona's husband died childless in 1828, she engineered a coup and seized power. Her first goal was to clear the path of all potential rival claimants to the throne, in order to proclaim herself Queen Ranavalona I. In a bloody start to what proved to be a bloody reign, Ranavalona kicked off her rule with a thoroughgoing massacre that claimed just about every member of the royal family she could get her hands on. It was taboo to spill royal blood, so she did them either by strangulation or by locking them in a cell and starving them to death. Having secured her throne against domestic challengers, she turned her attention to foreign threats and encroachments from European colonial powers. As a first step, she killed or expelled nearly all foreigners. When Madagascar was a hermit kingdom, to ensure that her realm had no potentially dangerous foreign contacts, Queen Ranavalona nullified all treaties with Britain and France, and banned Christianity. She effectively isolated Madagascar from the outside world, and turned it into a hermit kingdom. On the domestic front, in lieu of a legal system, she introduced trial by ordeal. The accused were fed poison and 3 pieces of chicken skin. If they vomited all 3 pieces of skin, they were innocent. If they did not, they were not and were accordingly executed. Ranavalona introduced widespread forced labor, whereby Madagascar's poor, the majority of the population, were made to work on her projects in lieu of high taxes they could not afford to pay, de facto slaves. They were used to build houses and palaces, clear lands and maintain roads, carry nobles and royal dependents in litters, serve in Ranavalona's army, and carry out any other tasks set them by the queen. They were unpaid, poorly fed if at all, and they died in droves. The failed British and French expeditions against this queen's realm. The era's European colonial powers, especially Britain and France, were unhappy with being shut out of Madagascar, where they had been welcomed by previous rulers. Queen Ranavalona's abrogation of the treaty with Britain cut her armies off from their main supply of modern weapons and left them vulnerable. The French, who held some small islands off Madagascar's coast and were interested in spreading their influence to the mainland, immediately took advantage of that vulnerability. In 1829, in Ranavalona's first year on the throne, a French expedition attacked some of her forts, but was repelled. France's efforts to expand into Madagascar were usually opposed by the British, who did not relish the prospect of a French colony athwart their trade route around the Cape of Good Hope to India. However, their mutual dislike of Queen Ranavalona's policies got them to temporarily set aside their differences. So they mounted joint punitive expeditions against Queen Ranavalona's realm, but the attempts ended in failure. When the Europeans retreated, the dangerous queen beheaded the corpses of their dead, put the heads on stakes, and lined them up on Madagascar's beaches, facing the ocean. The queen who enslaved a third of her subjects. Having fought off foreign interference, Queen Ranavalona unleashed her armies against her subjects. Forced conscription and mass forced labor enabled her to establish and support a standing army of around 30,000 men. She sent them on numerous punitive expeditions into those parts of Madagascar that were suspected of any resistance to her rule, or that expressed anything less than unabashed enthusiasm for her overlordship. The Queen's soldiers engaged in scorched earth policies, and devastated the regions that resisted, or whose people were suspected of harboring any thoughts about resisting her rule. By way of object lessons, Ranavalona's soldiers routinely massacred the inhabitants of towns and settlements viewed as disloyal. Those spared from the mass executions were enslaved and brought back to the heart of the dangerous queen's domain, where they toiled away the rest of their lives away as forced labor on her projects. Between 1820 to 1853, over 1 million slaves were seized, and the percentage of slaves rose to 1/3 of the population of Madagascar's Central Highlands and 2/3 of the population of Antananarivo, Ranavalona's capital. One of history's deadliest and most dangerous rulers, Queen Ranavalona I went down in history as a cruel and xenophobic tyrant. Contemporaries, especially foreign ones, condemned her policies in the strongest terms, and viewed them as the acts of a psychotically dangerous madwoman. Modern historic revisionism has toned down the madwoman narrative, and placed greater emphasis on the astuteness that enabled her to protect Madagascar from European encroachment. Nonetheless, there is ample ground to consider Ranavalona an exceptionally dangerous and deadly ruler. Between massacres, mistreatment, forced labor, and widespread famines caused by her scorched earth policies, and heavy-handed repression, Madagascar's population crashed. During a 6-year stretch from 1833 to 1839, the island's population is estimated to have declined from 5 million to 2.5 million inhabitants. In Ranavalona's own home district, the population took a nosedive from about 750,000 in 1829, her first year on the throne, to a mere 130,000 by 1842. Those are genocide-level figures, comparable to those inflicted by Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge on the people of Cambodia a century later. Unlike Pol Pot, however, Ranavalona was not chased out of power. After a reign that lasted for 33 years, she died in her sleep of natural causes, when she was 83 years old. A dangerous French buccaneer. During the golden age of piracy from the 1650s to 1730s, few outlaws of the sea were more dangerous than Anne de Laveau, a female French buccaneer. She earned a reputation for courage in combat and ruthlessness. Her name means Anne, God wants it. It was reportedly earned because her determination and willpower were so strong that whatever she wanted seemed to have been what God himself wanted. She arrived in the Caribbean as one of the so-called filles de roi, or king's daughters, impoverished women. Many of them convicted criminals, deported from mainland France to far-off colonies. There they were expected to turn a new leaf and start a new life, settle down, and marry French colonists. And ended up in Tortuga, off Haiti's northern coast. There in 1684 she married a buccaneer named Pierre Lalong, and had a child with him. When Lalong was killed in a fight in 1790, she married another buccaneer, Joseph Cherrill, and became a widow once more, in 1693 when Cherrill was killed in bar fight by another buccaneer, Lawrence de Groff. So Anne challenged de Groff to a duel to avenge her husband. A marriage proposal in the face of a drawn pistol. Lawrence de Groff drew his sword on Anne de Laveau when she challenged him. However, when she pulled out a pistol, cocked it and took aim, he had second thoughts, and remembered that chivalry forbids men from fighting women. He also proposed to her on the spot, supposedly because he admired the dangerous woman's courage. That could well have been true. But it was also true that she had a cocked pistol aimed at his chest, and the quick-thinking romantic gesture might have saved his life. Either way, Anne accepted. She accompanied him on his buccaneering, fought by his side, and shared his work and the command of his ship. Unlike other female pirates, Anne did not try to conceal her sex, but went about openly as a woman. Despite the superstition that women aboard ship were bad luck, Anne was considered a kind of mascot and lucky charm by her ship's crew. In 1693, she and her husband attacked the English in Jamaica, and in retaliation, the English in 1695 attacked Port-de-Paix in Haiti, where Anne dwelt when ashore. The English captured and sacked the town, and took Anne and her children prisoner. They were kept hostage for 3 years, before they were finally released in 1698. After her release from captivity, Anne de Laveau disappeared from the historic record. Unconfirmed stories claim that she and Lawrence de Groff settled in Mississippi or Alabama, but the last reliable mention of her simply states that died in 1710. The dangerous revolutionary who was labeled history's deadliest woman. Rosalia Samoilovna Zalkin, a Russian revolutionary and Soviet politician, better known as Rosalia Zemlyaka, was one of the organizers of the First Russian Revolution. More infamously, she was a key player in the Red Terror in the Crimea during the Russian Civil War in 1920 to 1921. Because of the latter feat, she has often been labeled history's deadliest woman. Yet, for somebody with such an infamous accomplishment, relatively little is known about her. For one thing, most of Zemlyaka's notoriety can be traced to a period of upheaval, during which record-keeping was spotty and ad hoc, to say the least. On top of that, many of the records that did exist were destroyed in the turmoil that engulfed Russia and the Soviet Union during her lifetime. For another, as a woman, neither her own party, the Bolsheviks, nor English-speaking Soviet scholars and historians put that much effort into documenting or digging up information about her. What is known from the records that do exist, and from the available historic evidence, is that Rosalia Zemlyaka was one of the key figures who helped organize the abortive Russian Revolution of 1905. 12 years later, during the Russian Civil War, she emerged as one of the main organizers of the Red Terror, after the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917. Particularly in 1920 to 1921, when she was one of the overseers of the Red Terror in the Crimea. A 15-year-old revolutionary. Rosalia Zemlyaka played a key role in mass executions that claimed the lives of tens of thousands at the low end of estimates, and hundreds of thousands at the high end. Her background had set her on the path to revolutionary activity from early on. She was born Rosalia Samoilovna Zalkin into a Jewish family in 1876, in what is now Belarus. Given the Tsarist government's anti-Semitism, it was unsurprising that her parents had revolutionary tendencies. Years later, the future killer recalled that one of her earliest childhood memories was of her parents' approval of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II by revolutionaries in 1881. While still a young girl, she was introduced to peasant populism by an older brother. She left school in 1891, at age 15, to dedicate her life to revolution. She was arrested by the Okhrana, the Tsarist political police, soon thereafter. By 1896, hardened by prison stints, Rosalia had moved from populism to Marxism. In 1902, she joined Lenin's faction of the Communist Party, the Bolsheviks. By then, Rosalia had adopted the revolutionary name Rosalia Zemlyaka and had become a tireless party organizer. In that capacity, she spent most of her time on travels between St. Petersburg, Odessa, and various cities abroad to meet with exiles. She was a prominent radical figure in Moscow during the 1905 Russian Revolution and played a key role in the organization of that city's barricades. As a known radical, Zemlyaka came in for a rough time in the subsequent Tsarist crackdown. It only hardened and made her even more dangerous. A tireless revolutionary. Rosalia Zemlyaka's advocacy of revolution and prohibited political activism got her jailed numerous times by the Tsarist authorities, and she caught tuberculosis and developed a heart disease behind bars. She finally fled Russia in 1909, her health broken to join Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders in exile. She returned to Moscow in 1914, seemingly a spent force only to spring back to life during the 1917 Russian Revolution. As a founding member of the Executive Committee of the Moscow Soviet, she was in on the ground floor of the Bolshevik hijacking of that revolution. Indeed, Zemlyaka played a key role in securing Moscow for the Bolsheviks during the October Revolution. In the ensuing Russian Civil War, she split her time between Moscow and various Bolshevik field armies, where she bucked up the troops as an electrifying speaker and political agitator. Lenin made her chief political commissar for the 8th Army in the Ukraine, then for that of the 13th Army. Her most famous or infamous mark, however, in which she established her cred as one of history's most dangerous women, was made during the Red Terror. A revolutionary whose extremism alarmed even the head of the Soviet secret police. The Red Terror was a period of extreme repression and mass killings carried out by the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. It began in 1918, after a failed attempt on Lenin's life. Rosalia Zemlyaka was involved in the repression campaign from the start, advocated for the annihilation of class enemies, and took part in carrying out the first batches of executions in Moscow. Her zeal and methods alarmed even Felix Dzerzhinsky, head of the Cheka. Considering that Dzerzhinsky was known among his circle of hardened revolutionaries as Iron Felix, it must have taken quite some doing to alarm him, yet that is just what Zemlyaka did. So in 1920 she was bundled out of Moscow and sent to the Crimea as secretary of the Crimean Regional Committee of the Russian Communist Party. When she arrived, that peninsula was one of the last remaining enclaves of the Whites, those opposed to the Bolshevik Reds. She took care of that in ruthless fashion. This dangerous revolutionary figured out a way to economize on mass murder. Rosalia Zemlyaka was determined to stamp out all traces of opposition to Bolshevik rule in the Crimea once and for all. In 1920, during the course of the Russian Civil War, the Red Army in the Crimea defeated the Bolsheviks' White Russian opponents, and eventually got about 50,000 of them surrender with the promise of an amnesty. Zemlyaka was not a big fan of honoring promises to opponents of the Bolshevik Revolution, whom she deemed dangerous, detestable, and beyond the pale. So she set out to exterminate them. Say what you will about her, but Zemlyaka was conscientious about her job, and about the need to economize on mass murder to ensure that it was done as cheaply as possible. At a time when the hard-pressed Bolshevik forces faced severe ammunition shortages, she decreed that to waste bullets on captives slated for execution was unreasonable. One of her cost-cutting measures to conserve ammunition was to not shoot people, but to tie rocks to the legs of the condemned, then toss them off barges into the sea. An underwater forest of swaying corpses. Rosalia Zemlyaka had tens of thousands executed by drowning with weights tied to their legs. When the waters were calm and visibility was good, rows of standing bodies off the shores of the Crimea could be seen at the bottom as they swayed like a horrific underwater forest and gently moved back and forth with the currents. The author of the macabre executions returned to Moscow and was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, then the highest Soviet military award. She spent the rest of her life climbing the Communist Party's rungs, and joined the Central Control Commission, the organization that kept a watchful eye on the party. Zemlyaka worked closely with the NKVD during the Great Terror, and so impressed Stalin with her ruthlessness, that she was made head of the Control Commission in 1939. That made her the only woman in the USSR's highest administrative body, the Council of People's Commissars. She died of natural causes at age 71 in 1947, and was honored with a burial in the Kremlin.